What if I told you that a country once celebrated as the cradle of democracy and philosophy sold its future? Not in a single dramatic act, but in a slow, almost invisible collapse. That the wealth of generations was mortgaged, not to criminals, but to institutions trusted by the world. Greece, a country with a history spanning millennia, found itself shackled by debt so enormous it seemed impossible to escape. But the mystery isn't just in the numbers. It's in the choices, the politics, and the hidden mechanisms of global finance that made this crisis inevitable. How did a nation whose very name is synonymous with civilization end up auctioning off its future to creditors, forcing its people into austerity and despair? Today, we'll unravel the Greek debt crisis from its origins to its aftermath, uncovering lessons that resonate far beyond the Mediterranean. To understand the Greek debt crisis, we have to go back in time. Decades before the headlines of 2010 shocked the world. Greece's economic journey is a story of ambition, mismanagement, and the seductive lure of easy money. After World War II, Greece was a nation rebuilding from rubble. The 1950s and 60s saw rapid growth, what economists call the Greek economic miracle. The country modernized its infrastructure, expanded education, and industrialized its economy. But this growth was fragile, built on borrowed money and a public sector hungry for expansion. By the late 1970s and 80s, Greece was joining the European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU. This opened doors to trade, investment, and, crucially, cheap credit. Politicians promised prosperity, and the citizens, long scarred by war and dictatorship, eagerly believed. Key figures emerge in this era. Andreas Papandreou, the charismatic socialist leader, and later Kostas Simitis, who championed Greece's entry into the Eurozone. Their policies were well-intentioned, but also marked by a tolerance for deficit spending. Public debt began to rise, quietly at first, and then with alarming speed. Visual, graph showing Greek debt to GDP ratio rising from 1970 to 2000. By the time Greece adopted the euro in 2001, it appeared to be a success story. Credit ratings were high, borrowing costs plummeted, and the government could finance massive spending projects at historically low interest rates. But beneath the glossy surface, the country had built a house of cards, one misstep away from collapse. The seeds of the crisis were planted long before 2009. Greece, like many nations, was living beyond its means. Government spending soared, particularly on public sector wages, pensions, and large-scale projects with questionable returns. Meanwhile, tax collection lagged. Some numbers are shocking. By 2009, Greece had a public debt exceeding 300 billion euros, roughly 120% of its GDP. To put that in perspective, imagine your household owing more than you earn in a year and growing debt faster than income. The Eurozone complicated matters. Joining the euro meant Greece could borrow at interest rates previously reserved for countries like Germany or France. Cheap credit encouraged risk-taking and complacency. Meanwhile, Greece's economy remained relatively uncompetitive. Productivity growth lagged, and the country relied heavily on tourism, shipping, and a few industrial exports, rather than a broad-based, resilient economy. Then there were the statistics fudged to meet Eurozone criteria, a practice later uncovered by the European Commission. Greece, desperate to join the euro, underreported deficits and used financial instruments to mask its real debt. In essence, the country presented itself as healthier than it really was. Visual, graph comparing official deficit versus real deficit numbers. This was the first major twist in the story, a national deception sanctioned by accountants and sometimes tolerated by European institutions. It created the illusion of fiscal stability and set the stage for an explosive correction. The early 2000s were heady years for Greece. Hosting the 2004 Olympics became both a point of national pride and a financial strain. Billions of euros were spent on stadiums, transport, and infrastructure. Loans were easy to obtain, and the country appeared unstoppable. The public largely ignored warning signs. Unemployment was low, wages were rising, and consumer debt fueled an illusion of prosperity. International investors were happy too. Greek bonds seemed safe because they were backed by the Eurozone. Credit rating agencies rated Greece highly, giving the country access to cheap money on global markets. But there was a hidden cost. Their interest on accumulating debt began to rise faster than the economy. By the mid-2000s, a significant portion of Greece's budget was dedicated solely to servicing debt. This meant fewer resources for hospitals, schools, and investment. Yet the political narrative remained optimistic. The twist here is the invisibility of risk. Debt, especially government debt, can feel abstract. Citizens often don't see the compounding interest nor the fragility of the system. But the pressure was mounting beneath the surface. Everything changed in 2008. The global financial crisis hit, and suddenly cheap money disappeared. Investors began scrutinizing debt levels that had once been ignored. For Greece, the revelation was brutal. The true extent of its deficit and borrowing became impossible to hide. In October 2009, Greece's new finance minister revealed that the deficit was nearly 12.7% of GDP, more than double the previous official estimate. The news sparked panic across Europe. Borrowing costs skyrocketed, with Greek bonds demanding interest rates over 15% at one point, unsustainable for any economy. The result was austerity. Greece accepted loans from the International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank, and European Commission, collectively known as the Troika. In return, the country had to slash public spending, increase taxes, and privatize state assets. Social unrest erupted. Protests, strikes, and political upheaval became daily life. Visual, footage of protests and economic hardship. Here's the twist that defines a crisis. Greece did not fail because of a single act of corruption or mismanagement alone. It failed because of the compounding effect of decades of structural weakness, global financial contagion, and political decisions made under the illusion of permanence. It was a debt trap, and the country had been digging it for years. The social consequences were staggering. Unemployment skyrocketed, particularly among the youth, reaching nearly 60% for those under 25 at its peak. GDP contracted sharply, wiping out wealth and savings. Healthcare and education suffered, crime rates rose, and emigration surged. The austerity measures themselves became a political flashpoint. Citizens faced pension cuts, tax hikes, and wage freezes. The European Union's insistence on fiscal discipline often clashed with the human cost. Greece was caught between two forces, the necessity of economic reform and the imperative to preserve social cohesion. Visual, IMF and EU officials in meetings, juxtaposed with Greek citizens protesting. Meanwhile, the debt continued to grow. Even with harsh austerity, interest payments consumed a significant portion of the budget. The irony was cruel. The more Greece tried to pay back its creditors, the deeper it sank into debt. Over the next decade, multiple bailout packages were attempted. In 2010, Greece received 110 billion euros. In 2012, 130 billion euros more. Yet each intervention came with strings attached: privatizations, pension reforms, tax hikes. These measures temporarily stabilized markets, but failed to address the underlying structural problems. Tax evasion remained rampant, public sector inefficiencies persisted, and the economy struggled to regain competitiveness. The cycle of borrowing, austerity, and social unrest repeated. The pattern reveals a harsh lesson. Temporary financial fixes cannot replace sustainable economic policy. The Greek crisis also became a cautionary tale for the Eurozone, exposing weaknesses in a monetary union without fiscal integration. Visual, graph comparing Greek debt levels 2020. Even today, the echoes of the crisis remain. Greece has slowly recovered GDP growth, but unemployment, inequality, and debt levels are still above pre-crisis benchmarks. The story is far from over. The Greek debt crisis is not an isolated phenomenon. Many nations today show similar patterns: high public debt, low growth, and reliance on external borrowing. Italy, Spain, and even parts of the US have experienced comparable fiscal strains. Globally, government debt has skyrocketed, trillions of dollars, much of it accumulated during crises. Financial institutions and investors often underestimate long-term risk, focusing on short-term gains. Consider this: Greece's peak debt to GDP ratio of 180% may seem extreme, but Japan's ratio now exceeds 250%. The lessons of Greece are repeating in subtle, dangerous ways. Economic complacency and over-reliance on debt are risks no society can afford to ignore. So, what can we learn from Greece's debt crisis? 3 key takeaways stand out. 1. Transparency matters. Hidden debt, fudged statistics, or opaque financial instruments are not minor issues. They can destabilize entire nations. 2. Structural reform is essential. Short-term bailouts cannot replace the need for productive economies, efficient tax systems, and competitive industries. 3. Debt has human costs. Numbers on a spreadsheet translate into lives affected. Unemployment, poverty, and emigration are very real consequences of fiscal mismanagement. The Greek debt crisis is both a story of caution and a mirror for the future. Nations may believe they can borrow their way to prosperity, but the ledger always comes due. The warning is clear: fiscal irresponsibility, hidden risks, and political complacency can sell a country's future faster than anyone realizes. As we watch the global economy today, we should ask which nations are quietly repeating Greece's mistakes, and how can citizens hold leaders accountable before it's too late. If you found this exploration insightful, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to uncover more stories where economics, history, and human choices collide, and dive into the discussion below. How do you think nations can avoid repeating Greece's mistakes?